What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Kilo Loco, and today we're going to be working with Flutter and AWS. We're going to be using AWS Amplify, and we're going to be covering the CRUD operations that allow you to create, read, update, and delete data locally. So with all that said, let's go ahead and jump right on in. So first, I'm going to show you that we do have a project already set up. If you want access to the code, the link is going to be in the description below. And we're just simply starting off with a project that looks like this. Just a couple of buttons, and we have create, we have read, which is going to be reading the entire database, read by ID, pretty self-explanatory, updating the object that we create, and delete. So as you can see, we have a couple of buttons here. That's our UI, and then we have the functions which are not filled out yet because we have to go through that process right now. So before we actually do any work in here, we need to start by creating an Amplify project. We're going to do that by jumping over to the browser, and we're going to just go ahead and go over to sandbox.amplifyapp.com. You head over there. It's going to show you a screen similar to this. You get started. We're going to be working with data. We want to save data, right? So we're going to select data. We're going to choose a blank schema because we want to just make our own object. You could choose these if you want, but that's what I'm going to do, you know. And we're going to create a new model. Now, I'm going to keep it very basic, and we're not going to do anything fancy, but I'm just going to go ahead and call this good old sexy object. Make it nice, right? Sexy object. We don't just want any object, we want a sexy object. Call it whatever you want. I'm going to add a field in here. We're just going to go ahead and call that value just so that you can see that you can have some type of value on here. It could be any of these types, whatever you want. Whatever you want, baby. And it's going to be required. So as you can see, we have this little check mark right here. That's saying that we're going to require that this object is created with this value. Same thing with ID. ID is automatically required. But that's all we're going to do. We're going to keep the object nice and simple. Now what we want to do is we want to actually test this. So we'll do next, test locally. And at the time of recording, Amplify actually doesn't support the Flutter plugin right out of the box, but what you can do for the easy workaround is actually just simply go straight to deploy. Now you will need an AWS account for that. There is a 12-month free tier that allows you to do all these things that you want, so feel free to sign up for that. But I'm gonna just simply go ahead and log in. I should already be logged in. It's gonna fast track me to this screen right here, and then I'm just gonna give my app a name. I'll just go ahead and call it Flutter DataStore Crud Ops. Whatever. Call it whatever you want. So we're gonna confirm deployment. It's gonna take a couple minutes for this to go through and set up our project. So let's go ahead and skip forward to now. So after all that's done, we're going to go ahead and click that button, open Admin UI. It's going to open up the dashboard for us, and we're going to just go over here to data. We can see our sexy object, bam, right there in your face. So now what we want to do is we want to go up here to local setup instructions. It's going to give us a command line prompt. Now we're going to go ahead and click this, and it's going to do the Amplify pull. Now, if you do not have the Amplify CLI on your machine, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go through one of these steps. It doesn't matter which one you choose. You're going to want to go through one of these steps, and once you get to step 3, you're going to see the install CLI. You're going to go ahead and copy this, and you're going to paste it into your terminal, wherever the terminal might be. It's going to be right here. You're going to paste it into your terminal right there, and you're going to press enter. It's going to download the CLI for you. I already have the CLI, so I don't need to worry about it. I just need to copy this one. It's going to do the Amplify pull because I already have the CLI. So we just go ahead and paste that in there. We hit enter, and then what it's going to do is it's going to see the project, the Amplify project. Well, first it has to sign in. It's going to see the Amplify project, it's going to authenticate you, and then it's going to pull down all the files that were generated and created for you. Once we go back over here, it's going to ask us a couple of questions to go through, and let's go ahead and move this up, and we're just going to say Visual Studio Code. We're going to say that we want to be using Flutter so it knows what type of environment it's working with, and it can put all the appropriate files into the appropriate places, like in the lib folder. So you can just keep pressing enter and it's going to do all the right things for you. So now, do you plan on modifying this backend? We're just going to hit enter. It's going to say yes. And all the default arguments are going to work seamlessly for us. So now that that is all done, if we were to clear it and we were to do ls, we're going to see that we have a new Amplify folder. And then we have over here and under the lib, you're going to notice that you have models and you have the model provider. We're going to be using that right now. And we have our sexy object. Now at this point, we have a couple of problems because we don't have the actual packages installed on our project. So what we need to do is we need to head over to our pubspec.yaml. And what we need to do under dependencies is add the Amplify dependencies. So there's going to be two that we need for this specific tutorial for CRUD. We're going to need the Amplify DataStore, or the Amplify core, and we're going to need Amplify DataStore, like that. We go ahead and Command S to save it. It's going to go out, get those packages, and once it's done, we'll be able to see that our objects are no longer going to be having problems. These files are going to turn to green. Everything's going to work flawlessly. Very nice. So once we have our models all set up and you want to make sure you have this configuration file in here, what we need to do is over here in our project, we need to start doing all the imports. So there's a couple of things that we need to import. We need to import the models that were created. So we need to import our model provider, the sexy object, and we need to import this configuration.dart file. We also need to import the packages for the Amplify core and the package for Amplify DataStore. So let's go ahead and add those imports now. All right, so as you can see, we have all of our imports set up, and down here in the state of my app, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to, first I need to create an instance of the Amplify core or the Amplify object, and then I need to configure Amplify with those plugins. So let's go ahead and create an instance of our Amplify object, and then also create a function where we're gonna be doing the configuration. All right, so we have an instance of our Amplify object, and then we have a configure Amplify function. Now what we want to do is we want to add each plugin that we plan on using. Now at this point we're only going to be using DataStore, so we're going to only add that plugin to Amplify. But in order to create the DataStore plugin, we actually need to create an instance of this model provider object. So we're going to create an instance of that, pass that into the DataStore plugin, and then we're going to configure Amplify that way. So let's do that now. All right, so as you can see here, we have the model provider, instance of the model provider, an instance of the DataStore plugin. We pass that DataStore plugin, and it's expecting an array of plugins. We're just simply going to pass in the one to our Amplify object, and then we're going to call Amplify configure on that object. So we're going to call configure with this Amplify config, which is provided through this Amplify configuration.dart file. And if you go ahead and take a look at that, you'll actually see that it's a constant with a string that was automatically generated for you, so you don't even have to worry about that. Now, just to make sure that everything did work as expected, let's go ahead and add a print statement as well. All right, so we'll know when it was configured. Lastly, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we call this function. I'm going to do it in the initializer of the state object. So as simple as that, init state, and then we're just going to call the configure Amplify. To make sure that everything is working so far, let's go ahead and run it and make sure that we do see the Amplify configured. Oh, and we ran into an error. So the reason why we ran into this error is because we actually forgot, well, I guess I forgot, you didn't forget, right? But I forgot that we actually need to be working with a higher version than what is automatically given to a Flutter project. So what we need to do is for iOS, we need to make sure that we go into the iOS folder And under the pod file, which is under right here, it's the pod file right here, we want to make sure that this line is uncommented. It needs to be uncommented. And then you want to specify which version that you're using. Now we're going to be working with iOS 14, but if you're working with anything with iOS 13 and higher, this is not going to be a problem. You just need to make sure that this is either iOS 13 or iOS 14. I'm working with iOS 14. I'll leave it at that. I'm going to save it, and then I will go ahead and run it again, and everything should hopefully work this time. All right, and there we go. Everything worked. We have the Amplify configured logged right there. So now that means that we're fully up and running with Amplify and we're ready to start saving data locally. So what we can do in order to kind of mock out this functionality is I'm gonna just start off by creating an object ID. So this is the ID that we're gonna be using to kind of pass into each object that we create. Each object requires an ID to be saved into the database. So we're gonna just keep working with the same one so that we're able to, you know, create an object with an ID, then delete that object that has that ID and constantly be working with that specific ID. All right, so we have our sexy ID. And now what we can do is we can start working on the actual CRUD functionality. So as you can see, I have each of these functions separated so that we can keep everything nice and contained. So each process that we're going to be working with is going to be an asynchronous process. That means that each of these functions need to be marked with async. And once they're marked with async, let's go ahead and start off by creating our very first sexy object. All right, so once we have an object created, which we do have here, right? And we given it an ID, and then we have a property called value, and we passed in a string because the value property is of type string, right? Once we have that object, then we simply try to save it to Amplify DataStore. Now this is going to be once again an asynchronous process, and it can throw an error. So we're going to wrap this in a try-catch block. All right, so as you can see, we're simply calling await amplify.datastore.save, and then we pass in an object. Now, regardless of the object, as long as it conforms to model, as long as it extends the model, and you can see that here when we go to our sexy object, you'll see that it extends this, this class model, and we can pass anything that extends model into this save function. As long as that's successful and we don't get an error, which we'll just simply print it out if we do, we'll be able to get to this line right here, and we'll print the sexy object as a string. So we'll essentially be seeing the JSON of that object. Now let's go ahead and save that, and let's see if we can get it to work by going back over to the app and hitting, we'll go ahead and clear our logs. And let's go ahead and hit create. And as you can see, saved sexy object, and then we see the ID is equal to sexy, and the value is don't you wish your object was hot like me. Oh yes, so it's pretty simple. Now we're gonna essentially be following this same format throughout each of these, so it's very consistent in regards to the API. So let's go ahead and move on to the read all. So we're going to essentially just do a query on our database, and we want to get a list of all the objects that have been saved. So we're going to end up with an array, but the array is only going to have one object since we only have this single object that was saved into the database. So once again, we are going to wrap everything in a try-catch, and then we're going to say our sexy objects is equal to whatever comes out of this query. So anytime you do a query, it's going to leave you with an array of whatever comes back. Now we're doing a very simple query where we're just simply saying, I want anything of this class type. In this case, it's sexy object. So we're going to get a list of sexy objects or whatever you pass in right here. And then we're simply going to print out the list to a string. So we already saved that. So now if we do read all, we get an array of sexy object, and you can see that we have our object right here as we expected. Next, we're going to do essentially the very same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this code right here, except I want to make sure that I'm limiting it to, I want to make sure that the query is limited to a predicate. And the predicate is going to allow me to specify what type of fields I want to specifically search for. In this case, I want to query by the ID. So in this query function right here, what we'll do is we're going to add an extra argument called where, and we're going to be able to pass in a predicate. Now you write a predicate like this. We would say whatever the object is, in this case it's sexy object like this, then we're going to say whatever field that we want, and the field is going to be all capitalized. So whatever property you're searching on is going to be in all caps. So you can see that these two are query fields. I'm going to query on the ID specifically, and I want to say that it's equal. So EQ is for equal. There's a number of different ways that you could query. And then what I want to do is I want it to be equal to the sexy ID we have right there. So let's go ahead and save that so that it formats for us. So once again, query the type of object that you want to query on. Then you pass in a predicate. We're going to do sexy object ID, where it's equal to the sexy ID, which is going to be what we added up here, right there. So same ID for the create. We're going to do that by the ID. This is still going to give us back in a list or an array of objects. So what we'll do is we're going to check if it's empty, because we may or may not have an object in there. So we want to check that, and then if we do have an object in there, we're going to make sure that we print that object out. All right, so as you can see, we're just simply checking if it's empty, because we don't want to run into an error if we try to call first, right? And if it is empty, we'll just simply print out that we didn't find any objects with that ID. If we do have this, if it is not empty, I should say, then what's going to happen is, actually this should probably be an else, right? Or I could just do return. We could do return. That's actually cleaner in my opinion. So we'll do return like so. So we'll return, and then you know, if we are able to get that first object, then we'll just simply do, we'll turn that sexy object to a string. So let's go ahead and save that again. Now we can clear this out, and we can read by ID, and as you can see, we found our object once again. Next, let's go ahead and do update. Now, an update is the same thing as a create. It's the exact same thing as a create. The only difference here is that you have to make sure that the IDs match. So an update is simply saving the same object ID with whatever updates that you have in the different fields. So since we need to pass in an object to save, what we want to do is we want to do a query by the ID that we're going to be updating, so that we have that actual object to work with. Then we're going to make a change on that object, and then we'll just simply save that object again. The only thing that we're not going to change is the ID, because that's what's going to essentially allow for an update. So instead of like going through this entire process and doing this all over again, I'm going to modify this read by ID function to return a future sexy object, so that we can just reuse this read by ID, get that object, and then update it as needed. All right, so as you can see, now we're returning this future sexy object. Since it's an await, it's after the await that we actually get the object. That's why it's going to be a future. And we're going to return null if this is empty, if this list or this query is empty. Then we're going to also return the sexy object if we do have it. And then we're simply going to throw an error if we can't, if whatever, something happens and goes wrong, right? So that allows us to do the update very easily. So let's go ahead and update that now. All right, so as you can see here, we're getting that sexy object by doing the read by ID, which is once again what we just created. And then we are going to make a copy of that sexy object, but we're going to make a copy with an updated value. So remember, the value is just simply the property that we decided to call it. We could have called it anything. It could have been age, name, whatever. So whatever the property is that we're updating, that's what you're going to put right here. But we're going to take the old value of sexy object, whatever it was, and simply append this string to it, just saying that it's updated. I can omit this if I wanted to completely change it to something different, but just showing that it's updated and still showing the original value, I thought that was a good way to show it. Next, we're simply going to run amplify.datastore.save again, but we're going to do it on that updated object. And once again, since the ID is not updated, or since the ID is not changed, we are doing an update, not a create. And then if all that works, we're simply going to print out that we updated the object to whatever the new object is. So we go ahead and save that. We open up our app and we let's go ahead and clear this, and let's go ahead and hit update. And as you can see, first it's going to print out the object that it's going to be updating, because remember, we're doing a print right here in the read by ID, and then it's going to show updated object 2, and then this is the new object. Essentially the ID is still sexy, right? That's what we called our ID. And then the value is, don't you wish your object was hot like me, with the updated right here added to the end. So we can see that this was clearly updated. So that's how you update. And then lastly, we need to delete. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. We're going to once again query the object that we need to work with, because we need to pass in an object that conforms to model into the delete function. Then we will simply delete it. All right, so as you can see, delete, extremely straightforward. Once again, we just need an object to work with. We need to know which object we're gonna delete. We pass that into Amplify DataStore.delete, and then bam, you just simply print out or do whatever you want. After you deleted that object, it says deleted object with ID, and then we just specify whatever ID was just simply deleted. So let's go ahead and save that. We're going to open up our app one last time, and once again, I wanna make sure that this is clear when I do it, and we run delete. And once again, I'm going to do a read. So it's going to print out because our function does so. And then it says deleted object with ID sexy. So if we do read all, we should get an empty array, which we do. And if we update, we get, let's see, oh, we got a little bit of an error, but no objects with ID sexy. And then there's also no value. There's no getter called value on null. So you know, I have to fix that a little bit up here. Where is it? All right, so the reason why it's doing that is because we're returning null when we should probably be throwing an error or something like that. But that's pretty much everything that you need to know in a nutshell. And that's pretty much it. It's pretty simple. As you saw, very easy to get up and running with CRUD operations. You follow a very similar pattern whenever you're working, whether it's creating, reading, updating, or deleting. Very simple, very straightforward. Now, all that data is stored locally, but if you want to do something like sync this data to the cloud, we're expecting to see an API plugin come in sometime in the near future in 2021 that is going to allow you to take this data and have it sync between devices, giving you a whole range of capabilities, allowing you to make your Flutter applications full-grown, full production-ready applications. So just be on the lookout for any updates that you see for Amplify DataStore, and make sure you keep checking back with us. Now, if you have any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments down below. There's also a Discord channel for the AWS team. If you have any questions about AWS Amplify, you can check out the Discord. And if there are any videos or any topics that you want covered with Flutter or any of the other platforms that I cover, then make sure you leave a comment down below. Like I said before, the code or the link to the repo is also in the description, so you can check that out. Now, that's going to be all for today. I hope you were able to CRUD your sexy objects, and I hope you really enjoy working with Amplify. So thank you for your time. Go out there and keep coding passionately.